What if the biggest update in 2026 isn't where Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine are, but what the world is no longer allowed to do to them? What if the real follow-up isn't new footage, not a surprise appearance, not another shaky clip filmed from a phone held too close, but the silence that followed, and what that silence is now protecting? For years, noise defined this story. Voices arguing over what was right. Videos dissected frame by frame. Strangers deciding who deserved help, who deserved blame, and who deserved to be watched. But in 2026, the most important change isn't loud at all. It's quiet. And quiet in this case is not absence. It is intention. Odd, West Virginia, has always been a place where life unfolds without witnesses. Long roads. Few neighbors. The kind of geography that lets people exist without explanation. For generations, that isolation wasn't a flaw. It was the structure that made survival possible. You learned to rely on routine, on familiarity, on knowing that tomorrow would look like yesterday. For the Whittaker family, that isolation shaped everything. How food was stretched, how heat was conserved, how illness was endured instead of treated, how help was interpreted as intrusion. Their world was small, but it was theirs. Then the internet arrived. And privacy didn't just crack, it shattered. The family didn't become known because they asked to be. They became known because they were discovered. Not celebrated. Not elevated. Discovered. Like an artifact. Like a warning. Like something to be stared at from a safe distance. People came for shock. Stayed for pity. Argued over morality. Claimed concern. Claimed outrage. Claimed ownership. And with every claim, the line between care and consumption blurred. In 2026, researchers have a name for this phenomenon. They call it the digital gaze. A loop where visibility creates attention, attention attracts outsiders, and outsiders bring pressure the vulnerable were never equipped to manage. In that loop, even help becomes distorted. Because help, real help, is not just money or supplies. It's stability, boundaries, protection. The kind that says no. No more filming. No more strangers. No more turning survival into spectacle. That's why this update begins where the loudest era ended, in the quiet. Because quiet can mean two very different things. It can mean abandonment, or it can mean safety. And in early 2026, the truth is uncomfortable but necessary to say plainly. The lives of Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine did not become perfect when the cameras stopped. But for the first time, their days became measurable, predictable, structured, less chaotic. And for the first time, some parts of their lives became private. That boundary is the real update. For years, people believed awareness required access. That caring required seeing. That protection meant proximity. But 2026 draws a different line. It asks whether the world's right to look ever outweighed their right to live without being watched. And the answer, finally, is no. What changed wasn't one decision or one placement. It was a shift in authority. The authority to say that vulnerability does not equal permission. That suffering does not belong to the audience. That being known does not mean being owned. That's not something you can capture on video. The early aftermath was confusing, even unsettling. When updates stopped, rumors filled the gap. Some assumed the worst. Others assumed nothing had changed at all. Silence was interpreted as secrecy, or cover-up, or failure. But the truth is more complex. Silence, in this case, is governed. It is legal. It is deliberate. And it exists because someone finally recognized that constant exposure was not neutral. It was harm. The 2026 update makes one thing clear from the start. The Whittakers' story split in two. One path led away from the house, into structured care, medical oversight, and legal protection. The other path stayed behind, rooted in the land, the house, the memories, and the grief that doesn't get managed by policy. Both paths matter, but they do not receive the same kind of attention. This is where the story stops being simple, because it is possible for an intervention to be necessary and still painful. It is possible for protection to save some while isolating others. It is possible for progress to look like loss from the outside. And it is possible for the internet to misunderstand all of it. The first thing 2026 forces us to confront is this: the absence of new footage is not evidence of neglect. It is evidence of restriction. A restriction that was overdue. For years, people demanded proof of improvement, proof of safety, proof that things were better. But better does not perform. Better does not trend. Better does not invite strangers into bedrooms, bathrooms, or medical routines. Better looks boring. Better looks like schedules, paperwork, consent forms, quiet hallways, repetition, patience. Better looks like days that don't need explaining. That's why the follow-up begins here, not with faces or clips, but with context. With the understanding that what changed most is not location, but access. Not visibility, but control. The question is no longer, where are they now? The question is, who is allowed to decide what we see? And in 2026, the answer is finally not the internet. The silence didn't arrive by accident. It arrived because the story reached a point where spectacle became incompatible with care, where curiosity became a liability, where the presence of cameras threatened the very stability people claimed to want. This is the part many don't like to hear, because it asks something uncomfortable of the audience. It asks restraint. It asks acceptance that not every story belongs to us, that not every update is ours to receive, that sometimes the most ethical outcome is not knowing. But restraint doesn't mean disengagement. It means responsibility. And responsibility begins with separating what is verified from what was invented. That work starts now. For years, Ray was treated like a mystery instead of a man. Online, his sounds were mimicked, turned into jokes, repeated without context. People didn't ask what they meant because asking would have required seeing him as a human body responding to stress instead of a character reacting for entertainment. The noise became his identity, and that identity became a shortcut for judgment. But the 2026 update reframes Ray's story in a way that strips the spectacle away. What was once labeled as strange behavior is now understood as a distress response. Care providers documented that the bark-like vocalizations spiked during moments of instability, unpredictable environments, unfamiliar people, loud settings, and decreased when daily routines became consistent. Predictability mattered. Calm mattered. Structure mattered. That insight alone changes everything. Because it means Ray wasn't performing. He was coping. For decades, Ray lived in conditions where medical stabilization wasn't possible. That isn't an insult to the family. It's a reality of poverty layered with isolation and compounded by cognitive disability. When filth becomes normalized, not out of neglectful intent but because there is no intervention, the body adapts in dangerous ways. The 2026 medical review describes a level of deterioration that could not be reversed inside the home. Severe skin fungal infections caused by prolonged exposure to moisture and unsanitary conditions were documented and treated within the first months of consistent care. Mobility issues, once dismissed as just how he is, were evaluated clinically. Hygiene was no longer a suggestion, it was a daily, supported process. This is not a miracle story. It is a delayed one. Ray did not suddenly become someone else. He became someone supported. Caregivers report that he remains nonverbal, but he is less agitated, more responsive, more settled. Sensory therapy reduced episodes of distress. His environment no longer changes without warning. His meals are regular. His medical needs are addressed instead of endured. And here is the hardest truth for many to accept. None of that could have happened while the house remained the center of his life. The 2026 research does not romanticize the conditions in Odd. It documents them plainly. Insects on counters, rotting food, unsafe temperatures, structural decay. These were not moral failures. They were the result of years without resources, oversight, or external accountability. Healing inside that environment was not realistic. So the update for Ray is not that he changed. It's that the system around him did. For the first time, he is treated as a patient instead of a curiosity. As a body deserving dignity instead of an image meant to provoke reaction. That shift matters more than any clip ever did. But the story does not end with Ray alone. Lorraine's experience exposes a different truth about long-term survival in chaos. She lived nearly 8 decades inside the same orbit. Same land. Same rhythms. Same instability. If you remember her only as a quiet presence on a porch, you missed the cost of endurance. The 2026 report confirms that Lorraine entered care with untreated medical needs that had been compounding for years. A head wound previously described as severe has since healed completely. Regular nutrition replaced irregular meals. Environmental stressors, cold, noise, unpredictability, were removed. Her life now is described with words that rarely appeared in earlier accounts. Quiet, routine, comfort. Those words sound small until you realize how long she lived without them. Lorraine's update is not dramatic. It is gentle. And that gentleness is precisely the point. She is no longer surviving. She is resting. And then there is Timmy. If Ray was misunderstood and Lorraine overlooked, Timmy was overexposed. For years, he was treated as if he belonged to the public. As if his presence justified proximity. As if being known meant being accessible. People argued over what was best for him while rarely asking what it meant to live under constant observation. The 2026 findings challenge nearly every assumption the internet made about him. In a structured environment, Timmy showed social growth that had been underestimated for years. Removed from the pressure of being filmed, prompted, and interpreted through someone else's narrative, he engaged differently. More independently. More intentionally. Care providers noted that his cognitive abilities were often minimized in chaotic settings. With consistent support, his communication improved. His interactions with peers and staff became more reciprocal. He was no longer reacting to an audience. He was participating in a community. That distinction matters. Because it reframes Timmy not as someone who needed to be saved by strangers, but as someone who needed boundaries enforced on his behalf. One of the most significant changes documented in 2026 is the establishment of formal guardianship. Not as a punishment, not as control, but as protection. That guardianship carries a specific purpose, preventing exploitation, including filming and digital monetization. For the first time in his adult life, Timmy is legally recognized as a private citizen. Read that again. Private citizen. No uploads. No surprise appearances. No commentary dissecting his behavior. No debates over his expressions. Just life. That is the update people didn't expect, because it doesn't satisfy curiosity. It denies access. It draws a line and enforces it. And for some viewers, that feels like loss. But ask yourself this, whose loss is it? The 2026 update lists progress in plain language, almost clinically. Hygiene improved through daily professional care. Nutrition stabilized through dietitian-approved meals. Safety increased through a monitored environment. Privacy protected through legal status. There is no drama in that list. No hero. No villain. just systems doing what systems should have done long ago. This is where the story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Because if these changes represent improvement, and by every measurable standard, they do, then the years of exposure were not neutral. They were harmful. Even when intentions were mixed. Even when money was raised. Even when some good came from it. The absence of cameras is not neglect. It is the correction. And corrections often feel abrupt to those who benefited from the previous arrangement. What happened in 2026 is not that the world stopped caring. It is that the world was told caring does not require watching. And that truth changes the role of everyone who followed this story. You are no longer an audience. You are a witness to the limits of entitlement. In the next part, the story turns to the hardest question of all. What happens when protection helps some, but leaves others behind? And whether the house itself can ever escape the gravity of what it became. Before continuing, share your thoughts respectfully. Do you believe privacy can be an act of care? Or do you think silence creates more questions than answers? Your perspective matters. Comment below. When the cameras stopped rolling, the silence didn't fall evenly. For some, it arrived as relief. For others, it landed like erasure. That is the uncomfortable middle of this story. What happens when intervention helps the most vulnerable, but fractures the people who were left behind? Because while Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy entered environments built around predictability and care, the house in Odd did not disappear. The land did not vanish. And the people still tied to that place did not stop existing just because the world stopped watching. The 2026 update forces a truth many avoided when the story was loud. Protection is not the same as healing, and healing is not evenly distributed. The house remains. It sits on the same land it always has, carrying decades of memory, routine, and loss. For years, it functioned as both refuge and risk. It sheltered people who had nowhere else to go, while slowly becoming a structure that could no longer support the lives inside it. When outsiders arrived with attention and money, the house became symbolic, proof of neglect to some, proof of resilience to others. But symbols are heavy things to live inside. According to the 2026 findings, once the most medically vulnerable were removed, the house began slipping back into familiar patterns. Not because of malice. Not because of indifference. But because systems were removed without being replaced. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit into hero narratives. The update describes the remaining residents as legally competent adults. That designation matters, because it explains why interventions stopped where it did. The state cannot force care onto individuals deemed capable of refusing it, even when those refusals lead back into instability. In the eyes of the law, autonomy overrides protection once a certain threshold is met. And that threshold does not account for grief. Betty's grief appears throughout the 2026 report, not as spectacle, but as quiet repetition. I miss them. I raised them. The house is too quiet now. These are not statements of protest. They are echoes of absence. She lived her entire adult life as a caregiver within a closed system. When that system dissolved, nothing stepped in to redefine her role. There was no transition support, no grief counseling, no structured reorientation from caretaker to individual. The update makes something painfully clear. When caregiving becomes identity, removal can feel like erasure. Larry's experience mirrors this in a different way. The report describes ongoing isolation, deteriorating living conditions, and a sense of being frozen in time. Repairs made during the height of online attention, new siding, a roof, appliances, did not create sustainability. They created temporary relief. Without oversight, without continued support, without the people the house once revolved around, structure gave way to entropy. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of planning. The 2026 research addresses the financial aftermath directly, and it does so without drama. Approximately $159,000 was raised through public donations during peak visibility. Of that, roughly $55,000 can be traced to home repairs and necessary purchases. The remainder becomes difficult to account for fully, with conflicting claims and no centralized fiduciary oversight. This is where public charity reveals its sharp edge. Money arrived faster than systems. Cash flowed without legal frameworks. There was no professional trustee, no restrictions, no accountability beyond goodwill. In a household shaped by crisis management rather than long-term planning, that money didn't build stability, it magnified existing fractures. The update avoids assigning villains. Instead, it identifies a pattern seen in many viral charity cases. When vulnerable families become global causes, funds are treated as solutions instead of tools. And tools without training can cause harm. The desire to buy the neighboring house, a plan documented in the report, illustrates this clearly. Staying close to familiar land felt like continuity. But the $200,000 price tag was unreachable once funds were depleted. The dream of expansion became another loss layered onto existing ones. And here's the part many avoid acknowledging: charity did not fail because people didn't care. It failed because care was not structured. That failure didn't just waste money. It attracted conflict. With no clear authority, people competed to define what help looked like. Some offered guidance. Some offered judgment. Some offered control. The family became a site of struggle rather than support, and the loudest voices often drowned out the most necessary ones. By early 2026, the research notes a shift. Fewer visitors, less online traffic, less attention. And with that decline came a dangerous assumption that silence meant resolution. It didn't. Silence meant separation. For Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, separation meant safety. For those remaining, it meant emptiness. This is where the story demands nuance. Intervention can be correct and still painful. Removal can be necessary and still traumatic. Protection can save lives while leaving emotional wreckage behind. The internet rarely holds space for that complexity. It prefers verdicts. But the 2026 update resists verdicts. It presents a landscape shaped by delayed care, unregulated charity, and the collision of poverty with visibility. It asks readers to sit with discomfort instead of rushing toward blame. And then it raises the question no one wanted to ask when the story was loud. What responsibility remains once attention fades? Because walking away is easy when the algorithm moves on. Responsibility is harder when there are no updates, no clips, no proof of improvement to share. The people still living in the house are no longer content. They are not characters. They are not symbols. They are individuals aging inside a structure that once held a family and now holds memory. The 2026 report does not provide closure here. It provides a pause. It suggests that while some lives stabilized through state care, others entered a quieter form of crisis, one marked by isolation rather than chaos. And isolation is harder to recognize because it doesn't perform. This is where ethical curiosity matters. Not curiosity that demands access. Not curiosity that seeks images. But curiosity that asks whether support can exist without spectacle. Whether help can be coordinated quietly. Whether systems can step in without cameras forcing their hand. The story of the Whittakers is no longer about exposure. It is about aftermath. And in the aftermath, the hardest truth is this: protecting some does not automatically heal all. In the next part, we confront the question that remains unresolved: what obligation exists toward the house itself, and whether intervention can be rebuilt without repeating the harms of the past. By 2026, The story stopped being about rescue and started being about responsibility. Not responsibility in the legal sense alone, but responsibility in the moral, communal, and structural sense. Because once emergency intervention ends, what remains is not a clean slate. What remains is residue, habits formed in crisis, relationships shaped by imbalance, and environments that don't self-correct just because attention disappears. The house is where that residue concentrates. It is easy to speak about buildings as objects: roofs, walls, floors, repairs. But in this case, the house has always been more than a structure. It functioned as a system. It dictated routines, behaviors, and survival strategies. When the system broke, removing people from it saved lives, but it did not reset the system itself. The 2026 update treats the house as an unresolved variable. It documents that while major repairs were once completed, roofing, siding, windows, those changes addressed exposure, not sustainability. A roof keeps rain out. It does not create order. Siding improves insulation. It does not establish hygiene. Appliances make storage possible. They do not ensure nutrition. Structure without support decays. After separation, the house lost its internal rhythm. Meals were no longer communal. Caregiving tasks vanished overnight. Silence replaced noise, but silence did not bring peace. It brought disorientation. The report describes a gradual return of disorder, not through neglect alone, but through overwhelm. When individuals spend decades managing survival minute to minute, they do not automatically shift into maintenance mode when crisis eases. Stability is a learned environment, not an instinct. This is the central misunderstanding that shaped much of the public response. Many believed that once money arrived, once repairs were made, once the worst was exposed, improvement would follow naturally. But improvement requires scaffolding, routines, accountability, and guidance that extend beyond crisis moments. Without that scaffolding, entropy wins. The 2026 findings also examine the social vacuum left behind. During peak attention, people arrived daily. Volunteers, viewers, helpers, critics, advisors. Everyone had an opinion, and many had plans. But as time passed, those voices faded. Not because the need ended, but because novelty did. The family remaining in the house did not suddenly become less deserving of care. They became less visible. That distinction matters. Visibility drove intervention. Invisibility now sustains neglect. Not imposed neglect, but systemic neglect born of absence. When no one is watching, no one coordinates. When no one coordinates, individuals are left to manage complexity they were never equipped to handle alone. The update is careful here. It does not suggest that the state abandoned the household out of cruelty. It explains that legal frameworks limit intervention when individuals are deemed competent, even if their quality of life remains poor. The system intervenes at thresholds, not ideals. And yet, this creates a gap, one where suffering can exist without triggering action. The research frames this gap as the post-intervention void. It appears after emergency removal, when immediate danger is resolved, but long-term rehabilitation is not implemented for those left behind. This void is not unique to this case. It appears in disaster zones after aid leaves, in hospitals after discharge, in families after custody changes. It is the space where outcomes diverge depending on whether secondary support exists. Here, secondary support did not materialize. No caseworker followed up consistently. No community-based organization assumed responsibility. No structured plan replaced the role the removed individuals once played within the household. So the house persisted, unchanged in its deeper function. And this raises an uncomfortable ethical question. Is intervention complete if it stabilizes some lives while leaving others to deteriorate quietly? The 2026 report does not answer this directly. Instead, it documents the psychological toll of this limbo. Grief without closure, caregiving without recipients, identity without purpose. Betty's words appear again in this section of the update, sparse and repetitive. They should be here. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I raised them. These are not arguments against intervention. They are expressions of displacement. When caregiving ends abruptly, especially without consent or preparation, it can feel like punishment even when it is necessary. That emotional contradiction is difficult for systems to address because it doesn't fit neatly into legal categories. Grief counseling was not provided. Transitional support was not structured. The report suggests this absence contributed to regression, not because individuals refused help, but because help was never offered in a form that matched their reality. This is where public discourse often collapses into blame. Some argue that the remaining adults should adapt. Others argue they should receive more assistance. Both sides miss the deeper issue. Adaptation requires tools, and tools must be taught, not assumed. The 2026 update emphasizes that stability is not a reward for good behavior. It is a condition that must be built deliberately. This brings us back to the money. The absence of financial oversight did more than create suspicion. It prevented long-term planning. Funds were used reactively instead of strategically. Immediate needs were met, but future sustainability was never secured. There was no trust established to manage assets. No budget designed for years, not months. No professional involved to redirect spending toward services rather than objects. The result was predictable: short-term improvement followed by long-term stagnation. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. The update makes a crucial point here. Charity without governance often recreates the very instability it seeks to fix. It places enormous responsibility on individuals who are already overwhelmed, then judges them for failing to meet expectations they were never prepared to handle. And when judgment replaces support, withdrawal follows. By early 2026, the house had become something the internet no longer wanted to see. Not because it was resolved, but because it was unresolved in ways that weren't dramatic enough to command attention. No new footage. No new revelations. Just slow decline. This is where the story pivots. Because the absence of spectacle creates an opportunity, if it is recognized. An opportunity to rebuild support without cameras. To create intervention that does not depend on virality. To replace reactive charity with deliberate care. But that opportunity requires something rare in online culture: restraint. The update calls for a shift from observation to accountability. From asking what happened, to asking what can responsibly happen next. It explicitly discourages trespassing, filming, or invasive inquiries. Instead, it invites verifiable, ethical information. Public records, observable conditions from lawful distances, documented support efforts. Not to expose, to understand. Because the goal is no longer awareness. The goal is prevention, preventing further decline, preventing isolation, preventing another crisis that forces emergency intervention. The story is no longer unfolding in public. That does not mean it is over. It means it has entered a phase that requires quieter forms of care. And that is harder. Harder to fund. Harder to coordinate. Harder to validate. But it is the only phase that leads anywhere worth going. If the loudest chapters taught anything, it is that attention alone is not protection. Before moving forward, share your thoughts below, especially if you believe care can exist without spectacle, and if accountability matters even when no one is watching. The hardest truth about this story is not what happened when the world was watching, But what happens now that it isn't? By 2026, the question is no longer where anyone is, or who made which mistake first. The real question is whether responsibility survives after attention fades. Because attention is loud, temporary, and emotional. Responsibility is quiet, permanent, and uncomfortable. What changed most is not a location. It is a boundary. For the first time, some people in this story are protected from being consumed by curiosity. Their lives are no longer open for commentary, analysis, or performance. That silence frustrates people who believe awareness equals access. But silence can also mean dignity. It can mean that decisions are being made without an audience demanding outcomes on its own timeline. That is progress, even when it feels unsatisfying. At the same time, silence does not automatically equal care. Privacy can coexist with neglect if no one is assigned to watch over the watchers. This is where ethical responsibility shifts away from individuals and toward systems. A system intervened. A system stabilized some lives. A system then stepped back. What remains is a gap, not of outrage, but of follow-through. The house still stands. The grief still exists. The people left behind still wake up every day inside a story that moved forward without them. And that reality doesn't fit neatly into heroes and villains. No one wins cleanly here. The lesson of 2026 is not that intervention failed. It's that intervention without continuity creates uneven outcomes. Saving the most vulnerable was necessary. But leaving the remaining adults without structured support ensured the cycle didn't truly end, it just shifted shape. This is where the internet must grow up. Not by inserting itself again. Not by demanding access. Not by turning quiet into suspicion, but by recognizing that ethical involvement sometimes means stepping back while still advocating for systems that work. That means asking better questions. Are there community services available that don't require public spectacle? Are there nonprofit or state-supported programs designed for adults aging in place with limited capacity? Are there safeguards to ensure the house doesn't quietly become dangerous again? These are not viral questions. They don't trend. But they matter. The future of this story will not be decided by comments, videos, or theories. It will be decided by whether accountability exists when no one is clapping. Whether care is offered without the promise of recognition. Whether dignity is respected even when curiosity is denied. If anything defines the real update of 2026, it is this shift. From watching suffering, to preventing it. From reacting, to maintaining. From spectacle, to responsibility. And that responsibility belongs to systems, communities, and institutions, not to vulnerable people who were never meant to carry it alone. If you've followed this story for years, this is the moment that matters most. Not what you know, but how you respond now that knowing no longer comes with access. Share your thoughts below. What does ethical care look like when the cameras are gone? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.